Welcome. In the first episode of this introduction to phenomenology, I talked about the life world, meaning the world we live in that's already here for us before we engage in scientific analysis or with theoretical concepts. In the second episode, I talked about encountering the world of another person through paying careful attention and seeking to understand what an experience is like for them, rather than trying to explain why it is the way it is. I mentioned that the what's it like is the qualitative dimension of the other person's experience. And the example I gave was asking someone to describe a time when they lost a loved one. So again, why is it that we attend carefully rather than trying to jump to an explanation of the other person's experience? Well, there's a very strong claim, starting with Husserl and running right through the tradition, that experiences of the world are given to us in a way that's always already meaningful. For many of you, the idea that experiences are already meaningful prior to our reflection might actually be shocking. You might even be revolted by the idea. Because at least since my own childhood in the late 70s and early 80s, if I can make a big generalization, liberal arts education in the U.S. seemed to almost exclusively emphasize how you, as an isolated individual, get to decide what things mean on your own. So your individual freedom to interpret what an event means was framed as absolute, inviolable, and relative to your personal preferences. Everything else was just a convention, or culture, or language, or maybe even oppression. Or alternatively, for materialists, maybe the apparent meaningfulness of your experiences was just your neurology constructing meanings on autopilot, meanings that you somehow know, this seeming meaningfulness is in a sense just representations generated by your brain cells. This kind of goes along with the view that consciousness is just an epiphenomenal byproduct of your neurology. A kind of chemical flickering that only looks and feels intrinsically meaningful to us because we're trapped inside our own heads. But to me as a young person, none of these worldviews, the relativism, the isolated individualism, the biological reductionism, none of those were credible or acceptable, which set me off in my 20s on a path into phenomenology. Because as you're going to see, phenomenology offers a very different, distinct, non-reductionist perspective that, for me, respects the qualitative depth and texture of lived experience. Phenomenologists like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty are asking us to carefully attend from a first-person perspective to our own experience of the world. In answering the what's it like question, it's important to recognize again that we're not being asked to explain anything. Instead, we're being asked to notice what's already here. In other words, what's already present experientially when we gather ourselves and pay attention. Here's an experiment you can try after watching this. Take a 5-minute break from the rest of your day, sit down, slow down, and for 5 minutes, do nothing except noticing what you're already aware of. What do you hear? What's the temperature that you sense with your skin? If you're outside, is there noise? What sensations, thoughts, emotions stand out to you? The point is that it's by resensitizing ourselves to the immediacy of our experience in the here and now that we begin to encounter this ongoing flow that's already given. Merleau-Ponty is referring to something like this in his book, The Phenomenology of Perception, when he mentions reawakening the basic experience of the world of which science is the second-order expression. Because it's these sounds, sensations, emotions, spontaneous reflections or imaginations that are already present with you before you reflectively take note of them. That is to say, the world and your experience of it is always already given to you in this way. Taking a break from being fully immersed in participating in the world and arriving more fully as an attentive observer begins to wake you up to the meaningful experience that you are already in the midst of. And by meaningful, I don't mean necessarily intellectually profound, though it could be. I don't mean necessarily emotionally moving, though it might be. You might notice boredom or a sense of anxiety or even a vague sense of being unable to put your finger on exactly what you're experiencing. Okay? From a phenomenological perspective, all of these possibilities are descriptive of the meaningful qualitative texture of your being here. So, if you want to do that exercise on your own, sit for 5 minutes, really note what it's like, and then take another 5 minutes to freely write about it, describing what you've noticed. Then you're done. What you'll have in front of you is a first take on writing qualitative description. The reason I framed this as an exercise is that when we shift to a more attentive, descriptive relationship to what it's like to be here, that's already a modification or an alteration of our default way of being here. And this typical default way is to already be absorbed in living in the world. And this is what Husserl calls a natural attitude. The natural attitude is the attitude we're already in when we open our eyes and begin perceiving the world and ourselves each morning. The attitude that you're already in when you face yourself in the mirror if you're brushing your teeth, when you're talking to your partner or kids or the dog at home, or out in the street or at work, or even the way that half awake you might reach out to turn off an alarm clock or grab a phone sitting next to the bed. All of these are examples of the default attitude with which we step into the world every morning. Let me say a few words about the phrase natural attitude. Since I notice that students often bring a bunch of assumptions about what they think that phrase implies. Sometimes when students see the phrase natural, or the word natural in front of attitude, they assume that natural must mean the same thing as good. And maybe this is a California thing, but sometimes students assume that a natural attitude is necessarily something healthy and positive, in contrast, I guess, to an unnatural attitude, which would presumably be bad. But no, natural here simply means an attitude that doesn't have to be reflected upon, doesn't need to be reflectively chosen, just comes spontaneously and is usually taken for granted, as just waking up in the morning. So one thing that natural means here is what comes automatically and isn't even normally recognized as an attitude. Let me give you some examples. In the morning when I wake up and begin to open my eyes, I don't need to ask myself, who am I? Or where am I? When I look in the mirror, I don't need to question who's looking back at me. Whether or not I like who I'm seeing, I know who it is. So, nor usually would I be struck by novelty or wonder, much less strangeness, in the appearance of my immediate surroundings. Whether it's my home or my companion if there's someone next to me, or family if there's a family around me, or the sound of birds singing outside, the street sounds that I'm used to hearing, all of these are the human and worldly surroundings that I take for granted because it's part of a life world in which I already find myself belonging. So as long as everything is more or less familiar, none of it particularly calls my attention because it's taken for granted. And that can come with a certain sense of comfort, or at least rhythm, and therefore familiarity. So building on the life world discussion from earlier, the natural attitude is the way that I automatically enter the life world in waking up in the morning in a way that doesn't feel like entering it at all because it's already always given to me as the world in which I participate. All of this is taken for granted, and for good reason. Consider for a minute why a natural attitude would be survival-oriented. Just on the level of being an animal and wanting to survive, being able to quickly orient in a practical way to my immediate surroundings is obviously survival-oriented. Imagine what it would be like if there wasn't this kind of default natural attitude. Imagine if waking up in the morning was like a machine that would have to clumsily boot up and start itself freshly every single time and reprocess and rediscover every single aspect of its surroundings as if for the first time. What if we had to reflectively process, who am I? What am I doing here? Who's sleeping next to me? Where am I going? As if from a blank slate each day. Now, in fact, there are movies about this exact scenario, but they're science fiction or horror, or maybe documentaries about a very particular pathology, because there's something creepy, something uncanny about a scenario in which the ordinary things of life become suddenly unfamiliar. There's a German word for uncanny, which I'm going to pronounce badly, unheimlich, which means precisely unhomelike. Uncanniness is the unhomelike. And not surprisingly, Husserl calls the life world that's given in the natural attitude your home world. home world. But, okay, am I saying that the home world, the world of the natural attitude, is always familiar and for that reason always comfortable? No, of course not. For example, if I'm waking up in the middle of a war zone in which, let's say I was briefly able to fall asleep for a few minutes and then maybe waking up is a fresh confrontation with the fact that everything is upside down and I genuinely don't remember exactly where I am, where I fell asleep, or who I was with, and I truly don't know what's going to happen next. So that's also a natural attitude, but in a war zone. Similarly, if I'm suffering from a severe psychological disturbance in which I genuinely find it difficult to situate myself as myself, or to recognize where I am, or if I'm undergoing such a difficult time in life that I'd rather not recognize where I am or what's next. All of these are also a kind of natural attitude under those circumstances. So what I'm trying to communicate is that the life that opens up in front of me in the morning is a life world in which I'm already participating, and which is already full of people, plans, projects, anticipations, desires, aversions, duties, ambitions, all of which are compelling in a whole range of ways, from the simplest biological ones, like I'm hungry, so I want to eat, I'm thirsty, so I want to drink, I need to get to work because I need to get there on time to keep my job, or if I have a family, I need to attend to everybody around me to help them get going, or there's a cat to feed or a dog to walk. In all these cases, there are real-world demands and motivations that are already operating on me the minute I open my eyes, and in relation to which I already orient myself for the day. To add one more variation, if I'm a practitioner of a particular religious tradition, part of that morning orientation could be prayer or meditation of some kind, which is yet another way of finding myself in the world. Alternatively, if I start the day in a particularly bodily way, maybe I'm stretching or exercising, same thing. So the natural attitude engages me as an embodied being, from the hunger that grips me, or the hunger of others that I need to attend to, the emotional horizon on which I enter the world in relation to other people and my own prospects. So in a natural attitude, I'm immersed in all of these interests. This is the point that I'm trying to make. And within this overall natural attitude, heavily conditioned by habits that are both personal and familial and cultural, one thing that you should imagine is in common, if I'm fortunate enough to have life conditions that are fairly stable, is the relative familiarity of the world I'm encountering. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm universalizing a comfortable first world middle class existence in the suburbs somewhere. So let's come back to the war zone example, since how many millions of people around the world are waking up to war or famine or disease today? Even if I'm waking up in a war zone in which I've been struggling to survive for months, there will be a kind of familiarity, even if it's torturous, and even that torturous familiarity of waking up in a day when, again, I need to search for food and water for my family. This would be a way of orienting myself to the world. It's already given to me the moment I open my eyes. So, for phenomenology, a natural attitude is a necessary and organic part of life, not necessarily something positive, it's just the default. And a natural attitude is not in contrast to an unnatural attitude. Instead, it's in contrast to a whole range of other possible attitudes that would be chosen rather than defaulted to. So, for example, a scientific attitude is a departure from the natural one because I need to actually make some kind of choice to begin to look at the world reflectively as a scientist or as a philosopher or as a psychologist, etc. Similarly, if I start the day with prayer or meditation, arguably this is intended to interrupt the default attitude by refocusing my attention. I'm not arguing that these chosen attitudes are universally better in a moral sense, simply that they're different from a natural attitude. So, since I've introduced natural attitude, the next step is going to be to describe what it's like to choose to set aside a natural attitude temporarily and more fully enter a phenomenological one. So for that, I'll see you next time.